The glory of Sparta reigns supreme in our minds. Yet, were you to attempt to visit today, you would be sorely disappointed. Rather than the proud remains of a once all-powerful city-state, tourists will find but a few scattered ruins. But what if you could travel back in time and visit the living, breathing world of ancient Sparta? Well, it turns out you didn't have to go that far back, as this was actually something that occurred in the past. Hundreds of years after Sparta's golden age, tourists from across the Mediterranean, including Emperor Augustus himself, flocked to see the fabled city. Today, let us explore the rise and fall of Sparta, from ancient superpower to tourist attraction. I've slowly been accumulating quite the library of history books to make these documentaries. However, as my shelves start to overflow, I've found it hard to absorb all the information I've accumulated so far, let alone explore other titles on my reading list. I'm sure in your own busy life, it can be tough to do all the reading you'd like to. Thankfully, our sponsor Blinkist has a solution. Blinkist is an app that takes thousands of nonfiction books and uses experts to distill them down to their most essential ideas for you to easily digest with text or audio in just 15 minutes. It's a great tool for getting up to speed on a wide range of subjects and deciding which ones you definitely want to read in full. As an example, I've recently been able to brush up on the late Roman Empire by listening to The Fate of Rome while walking my dog, and finally had a chance to listen to a discussion on the Stoic philosophy of Marcus Aurelius while getting the groceries. It's honestly been a really helpful app that I'd highly recommend. You can check it out right now by clicking the link in the description below to get a 7-day free trial. In addition, the first 100 people will get 25% off a full membership. Enjoy! The ancient tourism we will be discussing took place in the Roman era, many centuries after the rise and fall of Sparta. We could start there, but as with any good tour, I think it will be appropriate to cover the backstory first. So here we go. Sparta's origin stretched back to the early Bronze Age. However, during this time, it would be a pretty glacial era of development, with Sparta really only beginning its rise to power at the start of the Archaic period. This occurred locally at first, as several villages coalesced into a loose urban center that would have many similarities with the other developing city-states of the period. Over the 8th to 7th centuries BC, they used their collective might to dominate the area around them, first absorbing their immediate neighbors in Laconia and then in Messenia. In the ensuing 6th century BC, Sparta seems to have undergone a socio-political shakeup, which is traditionally attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus. However, modern scholarship proposes a more organic process that brought about a restructuring of the government and a more stark division between citizens and non-citizens, who were grouped together into the class of the Helots and the Perioikoi. The former were enslaved communities centered around Sparta and Messenia, who worked the lands and held virtually no rights, while the latter were free communities from the further flung areas of Spartan territory who held limited rights. Thus reformed, Sparta was able to find the stability necessary to continue its expansion. This at first came in the form of outright conquest, but soon transitioned to a foreign policy involving a series of unequal alliances we call the Peloponnesian League. Its members had to swear to follow wherever the Spartans led. By the 5th century BC, the power of the League was so significant that it elevated Sparta as the primary leader of the Greek world. This presented them with a unique opportunity to achieve greatness during the Greco-Persian Wars. Sparta's well-deserved victories and ensuing propagandizing helped further elevate them to the status of superstars in the ancient world. Over the next few decades, they would go on to compete with Athens in the Peloponnesian War to see who would be the true master of Greece. Ultimately, Sparta came out the victors, thus marking the ultimate pinnacle of their rise. This last century would be the snapshot in time for which they would be remembered for all eternity. It's the moment all tourists would hope to catch a glimpse of when they visited the site of Sparta long after its glory days had faded. However, were you to actually travel back in time, most people would be quite unimpressed. Thucydides, for instance, muses on this idea when he writes, quote, "Suppose, for example, that the city of Sparta were to become deserted and that only the temples and foundations of buildings remained. I think that future generations would, as time passed, find it very difficult to believe that the place had really been as powerful as it was represented to be. Yet the Spartans occupy 2/5 of the Peloponnese and stand at the head not only of the whole Peloponnese itself, but also of numerous allies and frontiers. Since, however, the city is not regularly planned and contains no temples or monuments of great significance, but is simply a collection of villages, in the ancient Hellenic way, its appearance would not come up to expectation. The city, at this time, mostly featured mud brick or wood structures, with very little in the way of monumental architecture, or even a wall. Clearly, Sparta had other factors that contributed to its power. According to Plutarch, if you were to ask King Cleomenes about this, he would reply, quote, "Cities ought not to be fortified with stones and timbers, but with the strong virtues of their inhabitants." He might also add his famous quip that Sparta had no need for walls. Its armed citizens were its walls. Yet unfortunately for him, the polis faced a crisis on this front. Around 500 BC, at the cusp of the Greco-Persian Wars, Sparta is estimated to have had a population of around 8,000 adult male citizens. However, by the time Sparta reigned as master of Greece, some 100 years later, its citizen population had cratered to just a few thousand as a result of wartime attrition, natural disaster, and wealth inequality, to name just a few factors. Thus, its hegemony was always tenuous at best, lasting but a pitiful 10 years before being brought down by other rising powers like Thebes. They were bested at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, and the following year saw Epaminondas invade the Peloponnese with an army of 35,000. In a series of crippling blows, many Spartan allies defected, the Messenian helots revolted, and the new city of Megalopolis was erected in Arcadia as a check on their ambitions. Sparta's powers completely collapsed, even more suddenly than it had risen. Shortly thereafter, Philip of Macedon and his reformed army swooped in to take control of Greece, and didn't even bother subduing Sparta. During the ensuing period, the city would struggle for relevance and attempted to pull out of its nosedive. King Aegeus IV and Cleomenes III, for example, instituted a series of reforms meant to bring back the Sparta of old. This involved redistributing land, forgiving debts, expanding citizenship, reinstituting the agoge, and overall trying to make Sparta great again. This had some success, but ultimately saw the city beaten back by its neighbors. As a symbol of its true decline, Sparta was even driven to erect its first set of walls for protection. But even this was not enough to resist its spiraling situation. By the end of the 2nd century BC, Sparta was absorbed into the Achaean League, had its walls torn down, had the agoge banned, and was forced to style itself in the manner of its peers. For all intents and purposes, the Sparta of legend was dead. However, memories of its past would live on, and it is this fact that would actually revive the city in the Roman era. The Romans had initially rubbed shoulders with the Greeks as they expanded across Italy and Sicily. Yet it was their wars against the successor kingdoms that really led them to dominate the Hellenic world. In these matters, Sparta stood to benefit from the change in management and actually sided with Rome in the final major Greek revolt against the invaders. The decision proved prudent. When the uprising was crushed, Sparta was rewarded with the status of a free city and finally allowed to return to her old ways and customs, at least within the bounds of what the provincial Roman governors would tolerate. It's around this time that we see Sparta 2.0 begin its reboot. There was much to be done. For example, when the Roman general Lucius Aemilius Paulus stopped by Sparta to pay his respects, he found little that remained of their ancestral way of life beyond a peculiar clothing and hairstyle adopted by the men. The Lycurgan laws of old had long since withered away, and recent generations had little actual interaction with their revered past. Those few who did were the teachers and philosophers who had taught themselves about Spartan history. As should be expected though, their understanding of the past was warped by legend and filtered through their own biases. The plans for a Sparta 2.0 were thus in many ways a caricature of some imagined reality. Initially, Sparta was able to make some headway under a brief period of stable Roman rule. However, this was soon disrupted by the civil wars of the 1st century BC, which saw armies march across Greece, draining vast pools of manpower and supplies. Luckily for Sparta, they once again backed the winning horse in the form of Augustus. When the victorious general became emperor, he awarded the city special attentions, honoring it with a personal visit in 22 BC. As always with Augustus though, the move had ulterior motives. He was attempting to stitch back together the fabric of a torn republic by presenting himself as a conservative ruler who would bring back the stability of the pre-war years. Associating himself with Sparta, the ultimate conservative symbol, was exactly what he needed. There was, however, the small problem we mentioned that Sparta had only just begun its reboot and didn't have much to show in the way of its supposed conservative chops. But that was something an emperor could certainly help with. Augustus came not just to visit, but to finance. During his trip, he acted the part of a wealthy tourist, observing the contests in the Agoge and dining in the common mess hall while spending heavily along the way. This set an incredible precedent that future emperors and other prominent elites would follow. Soon, a reciprocal relationship was formed whereby outsiders flocked to sponsor activities in the city, while it, in return, provided a piece of the true Spartan experience. The truer the experience, the better. You can imagine how this would go. In essence, a tourist trap was formed. So what would this experience have been like? Well, admittedly, we don't know much for sure. Early on, tourists may have been there to just pop in and observe the daily activities. It seems a hostel actually existed that could hold guests that arrived in town for this purpose. Popular attractions probably involved watching the routines of the Agoge. As we mentioned, these had evolved over time to be even more intense than ever. For example, stories told of an ancient Spartan practice known as the whipping, meant to commemorate an occasion where young Spartans had defended a shrine from Thracian barbarians using nothing but reeds. The event, as tradition told, involved the 17-year-old cohorts of the Agoge being given canes and tasked with defending the temple of Apollo against the unarmed 16-year-olds who were challenged to steal the cheeses kept inside. The infiltrator who stole the most cheese was crowned champion and had their blood drawn for dedication in the temple of Apollo Orthea. In Sparta 2.0 though, the event devolved into a more brutal practice whereby the youths merely stood in the temple and were whipped mercilessly. The last one standing was the champion. No fun and games or cheeses here. Such a spectacle though was likely a huge hit with the tourists, who were left with no choice but to admire the sheer badassery on display. Now this was the Sparta that they had heard about. Not some story of children stealing cheeses, but of young boys being whipped to death's doorstep. Over the centuries, the city leaned further into its new identity with pride. As money and attention flowed in, the old mud brick and stick Sparta got a makeover. New public buildings were constructed, monuments went up, temples were expanded, and all kinds of upgrades were made to keep the visitors coming. For example, to make the affairs of the Agoge more publicly accessible, an arena was set up outside the Temple of Artemis. Here, spectators could sit in stands richly decorated with statues of Spartan champions while observing youths training and competing for the honor of having themselves be added to the list of champions. Some foreigners were apparently so impressed that they even began sending their own sons to be brought up in the Agoge. Another popular attraction in Sparta 2.0 were its religious festivals. The three traditional ones were the Hyacinthia, the Carnea, and the Gymnopaedia, which together apparently attracted enormous crowds. The Hyacinthia involved a preservation of traditional songs and dances, as well as games on both foot and horse. The Carnea, in this period, is mostly described as a set of games, from which the victor would earn the right to have a statue set up. And finally, the Gymnopaedia was a celebration of Sparta's youth, who would collectively sing praises to Apollo, perform dances, and display their prowess in military and physical exercises. As if this weren't enough, when the second sophistic movement kicked off in the 100s AD and rekindled Greek glorification of the past, Sparta invented a brand new festival. It was called the Leonidaea, meant to celebrate the ancient heroes of Leonidas and Pausanias, who had fought against the Persians. Declamations were given in memory of the dead, and games in which only Spartan citizens could compete were held. The whole thing kicked off with a bang, as it started just as Trajan was ramping up his own campaigns against the Parthians in the east. Imperial propaganda was in full swing here, and the 120,000 sestertii prize pool certainly made sure that everyone was on board with the agenda. Thanks to all of these events, Sparta 2.0 was able to slowly claw its way back up from the pits of irrelevance and maintain a somewhat prominent position economically and politically on the Greek peninsula. However, things did not come without a cost. As we've mentioned, Sparta was forced to become an ever more elaborate parody of its past self to keep people interested. This cost resources. As a result, special taxes had to be enacted to secure enough funding from the wealthy notables of the city to help balance the budget. Yet still, the heavy crowds drawn by tourism, especially during popular festivals, sometimes broke the bank. Foot and cart traffic, for instance, wore down roads which had to be regularly maintained by the locals. In addition, population spikes would cause food shortages, which in turn kept prices high. 10 surviving inscriptions from the 2nd century alone show food shortages taking place, as well as 2 additional ones when Hadrian happened to pass nearby. As you can see, this was quite the tricky position for Sparta to be in. Trends seemed to be continuously pushing it to flex harder and harder to maintain its image, which proved increasingly difficult to maintain. And it might also cause some people to ask, to what end was all of this done anyways? Sparta at this time didn't boast a true military force throughout the period, and wasn't waging war on anyone to keep its practical skills honed. The most we hear from it in this regard was when it contributed manpower to the Roman army every now and then. But this was never in the form of some grand deployment of a scarlet-clad unit of hoplite super soldiers ready to kick butt on the battlefield. For example, in 214 AD, when Emperor Caracalla made ready for war against Parthia, he recruited a small, 500-man Spartan cohort. Though they are described by Herodian as a phalanx, funerary inscriptions seem to indicate that they were actually deployed as lightly armed troops, and we have no further records of their deeds. As proof of Sparta's military impotence, their militia would be defeated by a group of raiding Visigoths, who went on to sack the city in 396 AD. Sparta would eventually be rebuilt, but only as a smaller, even paler imitation of its past, and was ultimately abandoned completely within a century. Regional power shifted elsewhere, and it wasn't until the 1800s that the modern town of Sparta would be founded atop its remains. This is where Sparta 3.0 is today. I hope you've enjoyed this overview of the rise and fall of Sparta. It was quite incredible for me to learn about how it transformed itself over the years, as I had no idea previously that it existed as an ancient tourist attraction for far longer than it ever did as a military superstar. This fact also proves quite relevant when we learn that much of what we think we know about Sparta 1.0 comes from our records of the later theme park version of Sparta 2.0. This hopefully helps add context to our other videos on topics like the Spartan Mirage, which attempt to shed light on efforts made by modern historians to unearth the true, less caricatured history of Sparta 1.0. A huge thanks to the patrons for funding the channel, and to the researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other related videos. See you in the next one.